Well, good morning, everybody. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. I guess that's still appropriate, right? And I hope you had a great holiday season. My name is Jeff Adams, and I am Graceway. This morning, I want to tell my story. This is my story. Everybody here has a story. And as a church, we are really a composite of all of our stories. However, as lead pastor here for over 31 years, in large part, Graceway is my story, and that's why I think it's important this morning that I share my story with you, which I've never really done completely. You've been here for a while. You're very much aware that I came to faith as a university student many years ago. You've heard that story, and you know, at least most of you do if you've been here for a while, my wife and I. By the way, Cheryl is here today. She rarely is because she's always in the other wing with the 4-year-olds. I asked her to be here because this is as much her story as it is mine. And you know that we lived through a civil war in Central America for almost a decade. And what I would like to do is tell you a little bit more of that story. As I said, I've shared some things through the years, and if you've been around for a long time, you could put together a composite of several things that I'm going to be sharing this morning. Some of the things that I'll share this morning I've never shared with you before. In the early years, because of the sensitivity of many individuals involved, I felt that I could not, and since most of them are dead now, I think that I have the freedom to do so. Next week, I'm going to begin sharing with you what our leadership team has been working on since our leadership retreat this summer. We identified 7 key initiatives for our church, and I'll give you an update on where we stand in that process. I'm very excited about this. It's part of the Am Graceway series that Jim announced that we begin this morning. And we're going to talk about making disciples in the year 2016 and beyond. But this morning, I think that if you listen closely to what I'm going to say, you'll have a little better idea of why I'm so passionate about making disciples of Jesus Christ. I think that it may help you to understand what makes this weird guy tick. I think it may help you to understand why sometimes I struggle to connect with American Christianity. Let me tell you how this all came about. I'm the board chair of a U.S. mission organization called Christar, headquartered in Dallas, Texas, and have been for a number of years. Every year, our board adopts a learning topic, and we educate ourselves in that particular topic. And this year, back in January, we began learning about risk assessment, because Christar sends workers into the most difficult and dangerous places on earth. That's what we do. And we believe that it was very important for us to understand better how to assess the risk that people and their families were going to be in. How do we deal with that? How do we prepare our people? How do we protect them as much as possible? And somewhere in the spring, I guess it was probably around April or early May, I was in an email exchange with the president of the Christar U.S. board, Steve Coffey. And as we were talking, I don't know what I did or what I said, and he knew that we'd been through war and all of that, but I said some things, and I don't even think I realized what I was saying. And he wrote me back immediately and says, wait a minute. You have a very unusual, unique, multiple perspective on this issue. Every year we bring in an expert or two to speak to us about our topic for that year. This usually takes place in the month of October. And he said, what's unique about you? Number one, you lived through a high-risk experience for almost a decade. Number two, you, for many years, have been pastor of a church that sends workers into high-risk areas. And number three, you have worked sometimes as a consultant, going into dangerous places and helping people establish E&E plans. If you're not from a military background, it means escape and evacuation plans, security training, things of that nature. And it's just what we do. And you know that Graceway as a church is committed to reaching the least reached peoples in this world. And because of that, we go into places like northern Iraq. We go into places like Nepal and some of the more remote areas of India and China and wherever it may be in the world, Turkey for that matter. Those are just some of the strange places that we find ourselves. And so Steve said, would you consider being our expert this year? would you consider sharing with the rest of the board what you've experienced and what you've learned? I thought, well, I don't feel like much of an expert, but if there's something that I can share that would be a help, I'd be happy to do that. So we made that agreement, and the next few weeks I sat down to try to put together kind of a timeline, trying to get my mind clear. What would I share? How would I do this? And something very strange happened. It became very painful for me. And it was very difficult for me to even be on point for much more than a few minutes before I would break down and begin weeping uncontrollably, which is not really typical for my character. I'm like, wow, this is really strange. And it continued to happen. It continued to get worse. And every time I would sit down to work through it, I would have all these emotions that would just surface that I really couldn't even understand. And a couple of months later, kind of rambling here, a little nervous today. But a couple of months later, in a different conversation, unrelated, somebody said something about PTSD. And for whatever reason, it just slapped me in the face. Like, really? Really? I went home and talked to Cheryl about it and said, 30, 40 years ago, people didn't talk about PTSD, didn't know a lot. I would imagine that we might be struggling with that. And the more that we began to talk about it, the more convinced we were we needed some help. So we reached out to one of our pastors here, Jim Lee, and Jim was gracious enough to come to our home and has been coming to our home for the last several months, working with us, trying to peel the layers of onion off of over 30 years of pent-up emotions. It's been a pretty interesting experience. And by the way, just coming in this morning, a gentleman greeted me in the lobby, said, "Hey, just want you to know, you're not alone." He's a gentleman of my generation, went through war, and we didn't understand how to help people in situations like that. So he's been going to the VA hospital and been helped enormously by what they're helping him with to work through his issues. And I've had similar encouragement from others of you sitting right here this morning that are dealing with the same type of stuff. And by the way, there are people here, part of Graceway, that lived through the same experience that I'm going to be talking to you about this morning. So this is not unique to Cheryl and I. There are a number of older Salvadorans in our church that went through the same stuff that we went through and more. And you probably are even unaware of that and would be unaware of who they are. This is their story as well. And so what I did is as I began to put the presentation together and as Jim helped us to try to get a handle on emotions. Before I left for Christar in October, one morning I was with our leadership team, and just on the spur of the moment I said, "Hey, I just put together this presentation on risk for the Christar board. Could I use you as guinea pigs? Can I just do a test run?" And they said, "Sure." Well, about an hour later, after I had been reduced to an emotional basket case and had somehow made it through the story, they all looked at me and said, "You have to share this with the whole church. You have to." And I wasn't too excited about it. So I thought, okay. So they went to Dallas and spent about 2 hours feeling like a blubbering idiot, somehow trying to make it through. On our board, by the way, is Dr. Chip Davis, who is the head of counseling at Dallas Theological Seminary. Do you know how intimidating that is? Be sitting there in front of a guy like this, just bawling like a baby and thinking, man, he must think I am an absolute idiot. And he was so supportive. And in fact, one of the things that he said afterwards, he said, you're doing everything right. And he said, the more you tell your story, the more healing there is and the better it gets. So here's my story. It's part of the healing process. Being a disciple of Jesus Christ always involves risk. This is nothing new. And it began with our Lord and Savior himself. The unspeakable trauma that he went through on the cross, dying to pay the price for our sin, is absolutely our standard. That's the bar. And Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. The Apostle Paul understood that. You remember in Acts chapter 14, as he was leaving the churches in Galatia, he said to them that we must, through much tribulation, enter into the kingdom of God. Acts chapter 14, verse 22. In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12, Paul said that all who would live godly shall suffer persecution. And there's a passage that is really kind of a landmark for me in this area. It's in Acts chapter 21, verses 12 to 14. Paul was on his way back to Jerusalem for the last time. And the people that were with him, his missionary team, and other people that knew him and loved him that he was visiting with at the time, did their best to convince him not to go. They had a bad feeling about this. They said, Paul, you're going to go up to Jerusalem and something bad is going to happen. And then Paul answered in verse 13, he said, what do you mean to weep and to break my heart? For I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. And when he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, the will of the Lord be done. And that passage is important to me because I think there's a couple of overarching principles here that are very important. Number one, every one of us has a different level of risk tolerance. And especially when we're thinking about someone else's risk. And so as Paul's advisors and team members considered what was going on in Jerusalem and how Paul was getting ready to go there, they were more concerned for Paul's risk than he was. And Paul very graciously and totally listened to them with all due respect, and in the end disagreed and said, no, I'm convinced this is what God would have me to do. And at that point, they backed off and they said, okay, may God's will be done. The second overarching principle that Cheryl and I lived by at this time was that being willing to die for the cause of Christ is no excuse for recklessness or irresponsibility. In other words, you don't just charge head on into danger, but when you're willing to lay down your life for the cause of Christ, you try to be as responsible and wise as you possibly can. That was a maxim that we live by. 2 Corinthians 11, Paul talks about some of the things that he experienced. I promise you that if Paul lived today, he would be diagnosed with PTSD. He went through some horrible stuff. And I can remember one time in the middle of the war looking at that list and thinking, good night. We've lived through most of this too. In fact, we had some things on our list that Paul didn't have on his and vice versa. And then in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 17 and 18, Paul reflecting back on that and said this light tribulation, he called all of that this light tribulation. Our journey into high risk began with a move to Costa Rica. Cheryl and I moved to San Jose, Costa Rica in 1974 when our kids were very little. I can see you're looking at the picture now. That's a pre-mustache picture. That is an historic document. There are very few of those in the world. Our oldest girl had just turned 3, and our youngest girl was 5 weeks old when we, right out here in this parking lot, loaded all of our earthly possessions into a Volkswagen van, and we headed south. That was over 40 years ago. Mexico was a different country. Central America was a different place than it is today. The roads were pretty atrocious. There were highway robbers. There were ferries to cross over rivers. There were atrocious places to spend the night. There were guerrilla fighters in civil war in Guatemala. And somehow, several days later, we made it to San Jose, Costa Rica. We had no training. We had no formal Bible or theological studies at that time, no culture or language acquisition courses that would be offered to people like us today. No idea, honestly, we couldn't have defined for you what a missionary was supposed to be, and honestly, we were never really missionaries. I pastored churches. We had very little support other than what we received from this church here. And in time, the church where I would pastor for almost 8 years in El Salvador began to assume responsibility for our expenses there. I was simply doing there what I do here. Our first experience, believe it or not, with risk was not in El Salvador, but in Nicaragua. After about a year of living in San Jose, Costa Rica, we moved to Managua, Nicaragua. I put a map on the screen for those of you that are geographically challenged so that you can see where in the world Managua, Nicaragua is. When we moved there, we lived in the home of the district attorney for the city of Managua, a friend of ours. And this was right about the time the Sandinista movement was becoming very, very forceful. In fact, the DA's niece was one of the principal leaders of the Sandinista movement. We learned by personal experience how families are divided by this type of war, this type of revolution that occurs. And it was there for the first time that we began to experience the clear signs of revolution and danger. At issue was the all-powerful dictator, a man by the name of Anastasio Somoza. His nickname was Tachito. Be ready for this, he personally owned 52% of the gross national product of the country. Okay, that's one of the reasons why Central America went through a period of very stark rebellion, because that was typical in several places. Here's a picture of me with some friends sharing the gospel with Somoza in his office. He would not long after this be overthrown, and he would find what he thought was a safe refuge with a like-minded dictator in Paraguay. And not long after that, he would be immediately ushered into eternity by a shoulder-launched missile that took him out of his caravan in which he was traveling. And then, not long after that, 1976, our family picked up and moved to El Salvador, a country that would very soon find itself in a state of chaos and war. I've put a map of Central America here because I want you to notice something. All of the countries of Central America is not in South America, nor is it in North America. It's a separate landmass. It's called Central America. And all the countries are very small. It's that little bridge that connects North and South America. And I'm having you look at that map because I want you to notice the relative size of El Salvador to the other countries. El Salvador makes the other countries look giant, but the other countries are small countries. To give you an idea, El Salvador is just about the same size as the state of Massachusetts, which is hard to see on small maps of the United States. It's about the same size as the nation of Israel. Or, to give you a local example, if you this afternoon would go to Topeka, Kansas and drive to Columbia, Missouri, yeah, you could do that this afternoon easy, but if you would drive from Topeka, Kansas to Columbia, Missouri, you would have driven the equivalent of the entire distance of the country of El Salvador. And the width of it would be from about Liberty to Harrisonville. That's the size of El Salvador. Now imagine being in a landmass that small with about 5.5 million people at the time, and 100,000 people plus are killed in a civil war. Everything pretty much happens wherever you are. So it's not something that is happening over there or that you read about in the papers. It's pretty much in your face. The war, most people would date it from about 1979 to about 1992. Within a year of our arrival, most Westerners, including most missionaries, had left or were already making plans to leave. And for the duration of the war, outside of a few vested individuals, the biggest United States presence in the country would be 55 United States Special Forces Green Beret advisors. So with no judgment toward anyone who made other choices, I'm briefly going to share just a few examples to give you an idea of what it is to live in a high-risk area, and to give you an idea of what some disciples of Jesus Christ still face in ways that maybe you haven't experienced yourself. And as Jim said earlier, this is a PG-13 presentation, and that's why he recommended that any under 13 be escorted to the lobby. And if you didn't take us up on that, that's your decision as a parent. But I just want you to know it's a PG-13 presentation. It used to be an R presentation, but as we talked about this last week, you got to understand, I'm desensitized. And so I had about another dozen or two pictures in the presentation that the staff says, no, we need to go through and take those out. That's just not, we would better do that. So what you're going to see is typical of what you might see on the news, but they may be disturbing to some people. And so I just want to give you an idea of some of the stuff that we've taken the gruesome stuff out. And what I'm doing is a pretty greatly condensed version of what I did for our staff and what I did in Dallas. I think the main thing that I want you to understand is that our experience was not an event or two. It was not a period of unrest. But it was living in civil chaos, danger, and hot war for a period of almost 8 years, day in and day out. Sometimes, obviously, were more intense than others, but every day we knew that it's just a fact of life. Your lives are in varying degrees of danger. Sometimes we're extremely volatile. And there were nights when we honestly wondered if we would be around the next day. Even when actual combat was not active in the city, kidnappings, assassinations, threats, bombings, and other dangers were constant, and especially just being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And all of the images that you're going to be seeing this morning, most of them were taken within a short drive of our home. Some of them, our neighborhood. One of the houses that we lived in several houses over our time there, but in one house in one period of time, we were able to count over 200 people killed within a block of our house. On too many occasions to remember, we found ourselves on the floor during church services just like this, caught in firefights. People were just trained. You hit the floor. Once our staff during the week literally crawled on our bellies down the office hallway to find refuge during a firefight. I can honestly say that I have more experience in firefights than many soldiers who have done combat duty. It's not braggadocious, it's just that's what we experienced. One Sunday morning, a famous general's son was assassinated as he and his fiancée were ready to come into the church. He and his fiancée had just come to faith in Christ. They were going through premarital counseling and getting ready to be baptized. It was just before our third and final service of the morning, and Cheryl and the girls had gone home to get a tape recorder from me, and I was up on the platform ready to start the service, and our littlest girl had come into the church with the tape recorder to give it to Dad, and I took it from her, and I watched her as she walked out the back door of the church, and then just immediately, pow, 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 pow. Oh, crap. Everybody's on the floor, and I'm running down the aisle of the church, jumping over bodies, and ran to the outside. And the first thing that I can see is this kid's body, like a fountain on the ground. I had just seen my little girl walk through that door. She was probably about 6 at the time, 5 or 6. And can I tell you that I died in that minute? I could see that the car was gone, our car, but I'd been around enough to know that could be good or bad. And what had happened is that Cheryl was waiting on the curb, and the assassins had come up and were standing right beside her. They were dressed for church, so they would blend in fine. They had Uzis underneath their jackets. And as Cheryl they pulled out the Uzis and just opened fire, point-blank range, at this young man who had just exited his vehicle, who had parked right on the other side of Cheryl. Reliable sources said that I was on several death lists. We learned to deal with that, to live with that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be killed. It just means that you're a prominent individual whose death would contribute to the spirit of chaos in society, that in a communist insurgency is the desired result. One evening, after an evening service, I had to deal with a drunk who had come in with the express purpose of killing me. He got our attention by putting a hole in the church roof. While everybody else hit the ground, I had to go and disarm him and confront him. Picture that you're going to see now, it's got a child, hands on her head. That's a very personal image for Cheryl and I, because that's something that our own 2 daughters experienced one day on an outing to a park with their teacher. And were held at gunpoint because we discovered later the teacher had a piece of rolled up paper they thought could possibly be a bomb. Probably something you've never dealt with in Lee Summit or Wyandotte County or Raytown. But it was part of our reality. Some nights we would huddle together in safe rooms in our house during firefights, bombing, even a couple of earthquakes. At times we would feel the blast of up to 20 or 30 bombs. And literally for years we went to bed nightly to the sound of gunfire, 50-millimeter heavy guns and bombs. Can I tell you that it was hard the first 6 months that we lived here to go to sleep? We'd have to turn on fans to simulate the noise. One Christmas morning at 5:30, we were awakened by someone pounding on our door. I went to the door. I pulled back the little iron peephole that everybody had at that time to look through, and I could see a van that was open, and a figure of a man who was standing in front of the door. I didn't have my contacts on at the time, and I mistakenly thought that it was an American that we had met by chance earlier that week, whose daughter had been bit by a dog, and I thought, well, they're coming to find a doctor. They knew that we had a number of doctors in our church. And so I spoke to this individual in English, which is what probably saved my life. And as soon as I did that, he turned to the van and said in Spanish, "It's not them." And by that time, my eyes were beginning to focus, and I see a van with a bunch of guys in it who supposedly were ready to open fire, apparently mistaking us for the former residents of the house. There were occasions when we found bullets on the floor of our girls' bedroom. Once we discovered a divinely suspended bullet in the ceiling of our bedroom on a trajectory right where our heads would lay on the bed. There were several times that we experienced passing through what the insurgents call the point of no return. Those are the moments when there's no way out, even if you wanted out. There's just no way out. This is a picture of Archbishop Oscar Romero, who became a very active voice during the conflict. He was assassinated in 1980 while offering Mass. We heard the shot from our living room. Again, that's how close everything is. Some of you might remember, some of you who are older, remember the news reports from those days. Remember 5 nuns that were brutally killed. 4 were U.S. citizens. We saw them at the airport just about 5 to 10 minutes before they would be brutalized and killed. Again, you can't escape it. More than once, helicopter gunships hovered directly above our house, firing into our neighborhood. We witnessed jets firing into neighborhoods above and around us on multiple occasions. One day, when we lived in a 2-story house, I heard a clatter outside. It wasn't Santa Claus, but I went and I threw open the shutter and found myself looking down the business barrel of a tank. I've looked down more gun barrels than I can count, but that was the first and only time that I've looked down the barrel of a tank. I know the sound of live ammunition flying past my head. It's a sound you'll never forget. You'll always know what it is. It's kind of like smelling marijuana. You'll always know what it is. For months at a time, we lived under martial law. And precisely at the hour of curfew, people were just on notice. You're outside, you're shot on sight. Every night, the hour would hit, and within a minute, pop, 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 pop. People who didn't make it inside. One Sunday morning, in a service like this, a terrorist cell surrounded our church, demanding our offerings. In a daring move, our treasurer, a very wise man, took the offerings from the previous 2 services and taped them to the body of one of our pastors who was able to get out, and made a deal with him and promised to give them everything that came into the offering. They were so excited about that. He knew that would be the lowest offering of the day. This was all before internet and cell phones. We were cut off from communication and reliable news, often for a long period of time. We would seek clarity by listening to multiple news sources via shortwave radio. I don't want to load you down with a bunch of images like the ones that you're seeing this morning, but I don't know any way to share that with you other than visually. And you need to know that life did go on. It just did. We went to the store, kids went to school. Most days, we would go to the movies, we'd go out to eat, occasionally we'd go to the beach. But there's a specter of danger in your mind 24/7. You learn to drive down the street and look under cars. You learn what to be aware of, what not to be aware of. And sometimes people say, "Jeff, why'd you guys stay?" And there's basically two reasons that we would give. Number one was a sense of calling. Don't want to get super spiritual on you, but we believe that if God led us there, He could protect and provide for us. We believe that the safest place for a God follower is in total submission to God's guidance. Really believe that. And we really put that to the test. And the second reason is because we bonded with the incredible Salvadoran people. When you go through war together, there's just something that happens. And so Cheryl and I felt that we could not tell the people in our church to stay and trust God. And we would go back to the States because we could and trust God. We just didn't feel that that would be the thing to do. Would people have understood had we left? Yeah, probably so, but we just did not feel comfortable with that option. But because of that, even people of faith struggle with issues. Here's some of the issues that I struggle with. This is not all of them, but it's just some that come to my mind. After the general's son was assassinated coming into the church, we talked about that, and we realized that he was not assassinated coming into church because the people who assassinated him were anti-Christian. It's because they knew that he would be there at that time on Sunday morning. And so some of the leaders of our church said, hey, Pastor, look, we've taught you personal security techniques, and you've gotten pretty good at them. And we try to analyze that all the time, but we've got a hole in our security system. Everybody knows exactly where you're going to be on Sunday morning. And that's why they got this guy. So we're going to ask you to just leave the country every 3 to 5 weeks. And we're going to form a committee of 3 of us, and we're going to be the only ones besides your wife that knows when you're not going to be here. And so we started doing that. I started accepting invitations to speak in other places, and that's probably one of the things that kept me from being the next on the assassination list. We believed that Cheryl and the girls would be relatively safe at that time, in that particular moment of the war, the main danger being to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But can I tell you, that was a struggle? We were kind of like Paul. People thought that we should leave, and people would tell me things like, if you want to stay and be an idiot, that's fine, but get your wife and kids out of there. And with all due respect, like Paul, we just believe that's what God would have us to do. The former pastor here, Truman Dollar, concerned for our safety. He was very much a political animal. He contacted the highest levels of the State Department here and said, what can you do to help these guys? And their answer was, when American citizens take up residency in another country, especially a country with danger, the first thing they should do is register with the embassy. But we want you to tell them never to have any contact with us and never under any conditions to register with the embassy, because they're so embedded that they're more like locals. In fact, we had people in our church that didn't even really know that we were foreigners. They said, whatever they do, don't contact us. But here's the caveat. If something happens, or if Americans are evacuated, they're not getting out. So that was one of the issues we dealt with. I had to decide, do I carry a gun or not? A guy in our church came over to our house one night, gave me a 6-shooter. He said, Pastor, you're going to need this. So I carried that for a couple of weeks. It just felt weird. And then I began to think, if somebody comes into our house to get us, they're typically going to come in with a group of 4 to 6 guys, all with automatic weapons, AK-47s or Uzis, and I've got my 6-shooter revolver. This was the decision that I made. This is not a political statement, and this is not a political commentary on the carry and conceal issue and all that type of stuff. That's your decision. My decision was, I think I'm going to be a lot safer without it, and I'll just trust God. One day we were infiltrated by a United States Special Forces team. That was quite an experience because I didn't know who they were. I thought they were locals. They were that good. They came up to me after one of our services, speaking to me in flawless Spanish, and said, hey, Pastor, can we speak to you for a second privately? And at that moment, I had this sinking feeling like, oh boy, here it comes. So we went over to a corner. They switched over to English. and said, Pastor, we're United States Special Forces. We're getting ready to go into the field tomorrow, and we know who you are. We know about this church. We just wondered if you had some Spanish Bibles that we could put in our rucksacks to be able to take and give away. Wow. So we took them home, gave them lunch, and gave them some Bibles, knowing that, again, association with such people could be hazardous to our health. At one point, I was faced with the dilemma of providing information for the United States government or not. Ronald Reagan has just become president of the United States. It was pretty obvious to those of us who lived in the situation itself that the information he was getting was wrong. I met weekly with a mentor of mine for breakfast in the hotel where all of the press stayed at this time. I mean, all the press stayed in this one big hotel, like the Hanoi Hilton. And there was nobody else in the country. You could fly into El Salvador at that time. The planes were maybe a quarter filled, all locals or press or mercenaries, one or the other. And so we would meet there for breakfast once a week. And this is the same guy that trained me in security techniques and all the rest. And they had no idea who we were because there were no other Americans in the whole country. So they would speak loudly in English. And we would speak softly in Spanish, and they just figured that we were locals. But as an English speaker, I'm sitting there listening to them make up the news. Quite literally sometimes. How many are we going to say was killed over here at such and such a place? Or I need an ambush scene. How's the light over in this part of town at a certain time of day? It was just, it was pretty ridiculous. And so I was approached by a contact for a very well-known senator, whose name many of you would know, if I would fly to the States and debrief. And so I did. Took information to him that he took directly to the president. My objective was not to influence political decisions, but to inform factually. It was interesting to see U.S. policy changed within a very short time. But I did so knowing that if anybody ever found out, I would probably be killed. We had to deal with students who were pressured, abused, or tortured to fight by both sides. People of means would send their kids out to college in another country. Can I tell you, it was a pretty tough time. One of the young men in our church at the time, who was now a missionary himself in a very dangerous, very conflicted place, he was an advanced medical student whose uncle was one of the leaders of the communist insurgency. He was kidnapped, taken to a warehouse, and tortured to force him to join up. And he steadfastly resisted. He had become a believer in Jesus Christ, and he stood his ground. That has an effect on people. And just dealing with all of the consequences of that, dealing with multiple political factions in the church, the impossibility of neutrality. Do you understand that doctrinaire communism does not allow the possibility of neutrality? So you can't say we're neutral. That's not an option. So we learned to say, because we were one of the larger, if not the largest church in the country at that time, very prominent, and I knew that every time I opened my mouth, I was being recorded by moles in our church from all the various factions. And so we learned to say, we think the status quo stinks, but we disagree with the options that all the different other parties and sides are proposing. We are followers of Jesus Christ, and we believe that the only true hope for transformation and elimination of the current status quo is the gospel of Jesus Christ. But you can't just say that. So we had to organize our doctors and nurses and dentists and other medical personnel, go into the field and set up medical clinics in our neighborhood. The last year that I was there, we distributed almost $1 million worth of medical equipment and medicine from our local church. We got very involved in dealing with people, and because of that, over a period of time, we gained the respect of both sides, much like the Red Cross. We were the only church that I know of that did not have a war tax placed upon them, which is when the insurgency comes up and says, you will pay us so much a month or we will kill your pastor or bomb your church. And there were pastors who were killed. We had to deal with our attitudes toward those that fled the country, legally or illegally. That was a historic problem dating back to the first century when Christians first came under persecution. Very huge issue after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. But what I really want to share with you this morning is that there are psychological consequences even for people of faith. After more than 30 years, Cheryl and I are only beginning to come with grips with what we experienced. And I mentioned to you several years ago I had gone to a conference in California, and psychologists Cloud and Townsend. It was a huge step for me. When I was there, I started having flashbacks for the first time in years, and they helped me work through that. That was just, it was huge for me. I still it never entered my mind that I was dealing with a PTSD type of situation. In our time, PTSD was not talked about. We had no sending agency. We had no more than a handful of churches that would support us from time to time. We had gone through all of this, and there was nobody to really relate to except those of us that were living this together, and what a blessing that was. But again, we did not leave because of the war. We left because you called us back to lead this church. And God made it just as clear to us that this is what He wanted us to do, even though, can I be very honest, we did not want to. So one day we hopped on a plane in the middle of a war in El Salvador, got off the plane that evening here in Kansas City, and the next morning I got up and went to work. There was nobody to debrief with. There was no trauma counseling. There was nobody to talk to, and nobody who could possibly understand. And again, that's no one's fault. I don't say that in an angry way. I'm just telling you. That's all we knew to do. For years, both of us experienced what you've heard from a lot of war vets suffering from sudden movements, loud noises. If we had time this morning, I could tell you some what are now funny experiences we had in those early years. They weren't funny at the time, whenever those noises or whatnot would occur. We had to learn to deal with people in trauma. Our church growth was almost exclusively from new converts, and very few, if anyone, was untouched by the war. Losing loved ones, being in trauma situations themselves, a constant specter of kidnapping, death, accidental casualties, trying to counsel young women who had been brutalized and gang raped by combatants. It's a pretty nasty time. And we had to deal with the effects on our girls. You say, Jeff, how does this... Can I just tell you something? Until just recently, this is something Cheryl and I haven't even talked about among ourselves or with our girls. And basically because we haven't known how. I watched the great generation that went through World War II. They never knew how to deal with situations like this in those days either, and so most of them just came back and shut up because they knew it wouldn't do any good. And we kind of raised a generation in America where you just suck it up and be tough. My generation, the Vietnam generation, our people came back, and not only did they have to deal with the trauma, they had to deal with being spit on. And only recently have we started talking about things like PTSD. So we just shut up. Cheryl and I did. And that's not, can I just say something? That's not being tough. That's a defensive mechanism, and it's not healthy. Can I just tell you that? It's not healthy. Only in the last few weeks did Cheryl overhear our girls talking with each other, and they happened to be talking about a ditch behind our house where dead bodies used to be dumped. And we had no idea that they had seen that. Dealing with their curiosity about dead bodies, how we addressed that, those were rough things. Personally, dealing with blame and guilt. That's been the hardest thing for me. Feeling very inadequate, feeling very guilty, feeling like I wasn't a good provider, and also feeling cut off from human understanding. Who do you talk to? And can you see that this is one of the reasons that I have trouble connecting with American Christianity? And I don't say this in a judgmental way, and I don't say this in a boastful way. I'm just trying to be as honest and factual with you as I can. But this is why I don't get excited about pacifying people who are upset and want to leave the church over style of music or because they didn't get their way about this or that. I'm sorry, I can't relate to that. I don't understand that. And I'm not saying it's not important, and I'm not saying that your preferences are not valid. Please, that's not my point at all. I'm just telling you, I don't know how to deal with that. I don't know how to sit around and gripe about how bad the world is and all the bad stuff. No, I made my decision. I died a long time ago. And I don't want to waste a single day of my life sitting around griping about how bad things are. There's just too much to do. And I learned the benefit of having stayed in a high-risk place. Number one, I've already told you, we became one with the people. We sowed the seed for our current approach to making disciples. What do you do when your church grows from 400 to an outreach of 4,000 each week and they're all new converts? Well, you start thinking about how to make disciples. We were able to share the gospel with 2 presidents in 2 countries, 2 first ladies, and a first daughter. This gentleman is President Carlos Humberto Romero, who was the last president of the Salvadoran oligarchy. We had the joy of winning his wife to faith in Jesus Christ. This is President Jose Napoleon Duarte, who was the first president, non-oligarchy, and thanks to his personal assistant, who is a member of Graceway, we were able to share the gospel with him and his wife and his daughter. We lived through a time in El Salvador where the number of evangelical believers grew from 2 to 20% in 4 years. Thousands and thousands of people coming to faith in Jesus Christ. Participated in the formation of the first foreign mission board in the history of El Salvador. We sat around a hotel conference room at a time when it was hard to get aspirin in the country. And we were totally cut off from the rest of the world, and we were crazy enough to start a foreign mission board. Part of that board was a man by the name of Luis Bush. Luis is taking the picture, so he's not in the picture, but Luis is the guy who coined the phrase 1040 window, if you've ever heard of that. He did that while he was in El Salvador. And you know what that's done? This is the reason sometimes you see me traveling to these weird places around the world. Because of what we've been through, I can go to South Africa, I can go to Ethiopia, I can go to Morocco, I can go to northern Iraq, I can go to places like that. Give me 5 minutes, and there's a connection. A lot of American pastors travel around the world because they got the answer to everybody's problem, and people are very polite and come to listen to them, and they leave, and it's like, okay, give me 5 minutes, and we're connected. It's just a gift. We learned some principles. Number one, we learned the importance of local church wisdom. Say, how did you decide to stay? We made an agreement with the leaders of our church. We said, we're in this for the duration. Unless and until you ask us to leave, because we have become a liability to you. We're willing to die, but not needlessly. So you're going to make the decision for us. We trust you to do that. And then Cheryl one time articulated what we call grace on an as-needed basis. If you've been in the military, you know about need to know. Well, Cheryl came up with the concept of grace as needed. People sometimes, and we never, like I say, we were not typical missionaries. We didn't do furloughs and all that type of stuff. But the few times when we would come back to visit family, people would say, how do you do this? And Cheryl said, God just gives us grace. And you can't understand that because you don't need it. God doesn't give it to you because you don't need it right now. But if he called you to go through the same thing, he would give you that grace too. It's just what he does. He's God. It's not that we're any better or different than anybody else. It's just God gives grace on an as-needed basis. And personally, I learned the absolute necessity of spousal support. And this lady sitting right down here in front of me this morning, I love you. Not my story, it's her story too. I don't know of a lot of women that would be willing to raise two young, under 10 years of age, blonde-haired daughters in the middle of a civil war. And I've shared this with you this morning. I've gone a little over time. Forgive me, everybody. Others right here this morning experienced similar things. Some of you, I'm sure, have been through worse things. If you are wrestling, don't wait as long as we did to get help. There is help available. The fact that I made this through without breaking down totally is evidence I'm doing a lot better. You shop and work beside immigrants who have stories that you couldn't even believe. You might want to get to know some of them. And some of them are right here in this church. Focus on making disciples at Graceway. It comes from a time in Central America with no materials, no books, no way to print much, no seminars, no videos. Just getting with God in the Bible and saying, God, what in the world do we do? Difficulty connecting with the American church culture. And that's my problem. Please, there are many wonderful believers in churches in this country, and please don't think for a moment that I don't recognize that. I do, and I'm grateful for that. But please listen to my story and understand why sometimes it's hard for me to make that connection. My challenge to you is to reach out to people around you that might be living a story like mine. There's a lot of anger and hate going on in our country right now toward immigrants, especially toward those of a Muslim background. We have Muslim background believers who are members of this church. From time to time, we have Muslim friends who are not believers that visit our church. We have thousands of Muslim immigrants in this city. Many are now U.S. citizens. Many of them are fearful. I can remember not long, the Sunday after 9/11, looking out in this section right here, and there were a bunch of international students sitting there. Most of them were Asians that day. And I can remember the look of terror on their face. Sitting in a church in the heart of America, terrorized because everybody was angry at anybody who wasn't white. And I remember going down and praying with them and talking with them. Great time to reach out and simply be a compassionate listening ear. And just maybe in the process you might gain the right to share with them the good news of Jesus Christ. You are Graceway. What are you willing to endure for the cause of Jesus Christ? Would you be willing to be inconvenienced for the cause of Jesus Christ? We've made our faith today a matter of consumerism. It's all about what's in it for me. And there's so much in it for us in Jesus. We know that. That's part of the package, and we love that. But there's so much more to it. You are Graceway. Father, this morning, God, thank you for grace to be able to just share a little bit. And God, I pray for people right here in this room that are going through the same thing that Cheryl and I are going through. And maybe some people that, like we were, just clueless. Lord, maybe today you'll turn on some light bulbs in their mind, just like you did in mine some months ago, and realize that it's time to get some help. So God, would you just touch us as we end this year and get ready to start a new year? As we focus this next week on making disciples of Jesus Christ, would you help us to focus on making the main thing the main thing? God, I thank you for this church. I thank you for the many, many people in this church who know exactly what I'm talking about this morning. Embolden them and encourage them. In Jesus' name, amen.
Left with one question, which is, what are we willing to endure? That is who we are. It explains so much of why, as a church, we do what we do, and the way that we do it, and the heart behind the reason that we do it. I'm going to go ahead and have the ushers come forward, and as they do, I implore you to consider, what are you willing to endure? Most of us, 99% of us in this room will never experience something like that. But we all have a part in this greater story, in this bigger story, whether it's your neighbor, your sister, your coworker. We have a part in God's story. And that is what makes us Graceway. That is what makes us part of God's kingdom. We invite you to partner with us. The ushers are going to come by in a minute, and as you know, you can give through the bucket. You can also use the PushPay app. But all of this is about helping to spread the message of Jesus Christ to the world. That is what we care about. That is what matters. And we do that through missions, and we do that through discipleship. Come back next week. Join us as we start to lay out how discipleship is going to look in 2016 and beyond. That's what this is about. That is the reason that we started here with Jeff's message today. Father, I love you. Lord, I thank you so much for today. Lord, I thank you for Jeff's story. I thank you for the way that you have used his and Cheryl's life to change who we are. Lord, not just in El Salvador, but here. Lord, they have helped to open up our eyes to what you are doing around the world. And Lord, we greatly want to be a part of that every single day of our life. We love you. We thank you. I pray that you would use this offering to further your name. I pray that you would use this offering, Lord, just to change lives here and around the world. Amen. Go ahead and be seated. We'll take the offering.
Chains be broken, lives be healed, eyes be opened, Christ is revealed. to